Professor Ravinder Kumar, for taking time out of his busy schedule and agreeing to chair today's session. I welcome faculty members of other departments and centers of Jamia and faculty members of the Nelson Mandela Center and other centers and departments of Jamia. A special welcome to all the research scholars, the MA students, alumni of the Nelson Mandela Center, and also to others who may not be linked with Jamia but are interested in the theme of the lecture. Most of you are aware that Jamia has completed 100 years. This extension lecture is therefore being organized as part of the centenary celebrations of Jamia. Along with this achievement, the Nelson Mandela Center has also completed 15 years of its existence. The center was launched in 2004 and was one of the first centers for peace and conflict resolution to be established at an Indian university. The center runs a 2-year master's program in conflict analysis and peace building, and it also runs an MPhil PhD program in peace and conflict studies. One of the courses taught as part of the MA program is Arms Control and Disarmament. And today's lecture has been organized around this theme. The exact title of the lecture is the current nuclear arms control and disarmament landscape. Before I introduce these, certain that I would want to mention. First, I wish to inform all of you that this lecture is being recorded. So please keep your mobile silent mode. Also, until the speaker is speaking and delivering the lecture, please keep your audio muted so that there is no disturbance and there is no distraction caused to her. If you wish to pose any questions or want to comment, please use the chat box to take these up in the Q&A session after the lecture. Before I hand over the proceedings to the chair, it is my duty to introduce him. So our chair today is the Dean Faculty of Social Sciences, Professor Ravinder Kumar. Professor Kumar is currently the Dean, and he's also a professor in the Department of Commerce and Business Studies. He has a PhD in management and is a member of the International Leadership Association of the University of Maryland, USA. He has 24 plus years of teaching research experience and has 15 plus research articles and books to his credit. Looking forward to the lecture and the interaction post the lecture. I once again welcome all of you. Over to you, Dean sir. Professor Kumar, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Professor Kaushiki. Good afternoon, one and all. Professor Kaushiki, Honorary Director, Nelson Mandela Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution. Honorable Speaker of the Day, Dr. Manpreet Sethi, Senior Fellow, Center for Air Power Studies, that is CAPS. Dr. Resmi Kazi, convener of the event. Professor Tasni Minai, formerly Director of the Center and Dean of Student Welfare. Other invited dignitaries, students, research scholars, and audience. My dear friends, ladies and gentlemen. At the very onset, I greet the center to schedule an extension lecture on such a burning issue, the current nuclear arms control and disarmament landscape. It is my great honor to chair the lecture initially, as due to some other engagements, I will not be able to afford the session throughout. The adoption of the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the first legally binding such international agreement to comprehensively prohibit nuclear weapons with the goal of leading towards their total elimination in July 2017, reflected a recognition by some states and civil society organizations that an explicit ban on nuclear weapons constitutes an integral part of the normative framework which is crucial to achieve and maintain nuclear abolition. It also enforced new political reality founded on the humanitarian imperative for nuclear abolition. It confirmed that the nuclear prohibition treaty had structured and implemented did not constitute a credible part to abolition. On the other hand, nuclear armed states and their allies, including the United States and most other NATO members, such as Germany and Canada, have actively opposed this effort and have openly tried to undermine its rationale. Notwithstanding, a clear majority in the international community is determined to continue advancing the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapon effort with its entry into force and universalization top priorities. According to the treaty's provisions, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons will officially enter into force once it is ratified by 50 independent states. At the present rate, it seems likely that the treaty will enter into force soon, as it has already been ratified by 45 states by 23rd September 2020. Such an achievement will bring further attention to the deep global divisions and frustration that prompted the negotiation of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapon in the first place. Friends, by not taking much of a precious time with these few words about the significance of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapon, it highlights the relevance of today's extension lecture 2. On behalf of the University, Faculty of Social Sciences, and the Nelson Mandela Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution, I wholeheartedly welcome our honorable speaker, Dr. Mantri Sethi, Senior Fellow, Center for Economic Studies, an acclaimed academician and researcher like Mantri Sethi needs no introduction in the academic world. However, as a protocol, let me share with the esteemed audience her brief profile. Dr. Mantri Sethi, Distinguished Fellow at the Center for Air Power Studies, that is CAPS, New Delhi, has been leading a project on nuclear security at the center for the last 15 years. She is an expert on the entire spectrum of nuclear issues, ranging from nuclear energy, strategy, non-proliferation, disarmament, arm control, and ballistic missile defense. She has authored, edited, and co-authored 8 books and 3 monographs. She also has published about 100 quality papers in books and academic journals of repute. Her book, Nuclear Strategy, India's March Toward Multiple Deterrence 2009, is deemed essential reading at many colleges and armed force institutions. Dr. Manpreet received her PhD from the Center for Latin American and West European Studies, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, in 1997. Soon thereafter, she started her career as an analyst specializing in nuclear issues at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, IDSA, New Delhi. That is New Delhi's only national security think tank at the time, at national level. She worked there until 2002 and thereafter joined CAPS just as it was established, I mean, as a founder member. As a founder member, she helped start the nuclear research program at the center and it's today at the forefront of national nuclear study and analysis, known to everyone. Dr. Sethi delivers lectures regularly at National Defense College and other leading establishments. India Armed Forces, Police and Foreign Services, as also at various colleges and universities. She has mentored several young scholars and officers through her nuclear security group at CAP and as an external examiner for MPhil students at JNU University of Delhi and Madras University. She has been conducting a biannual nuclear strategy capsule for senior officers of the Armed Forces, Ministry of External Affairs, Department of Atomic Energy, Defense Research and Development Organization, and National Security Council Secretariat as well for the last 14 years. Over 1,400 officers have benefited from the exercise. Dr. Mantri Sethi has been a regular participant in all flagship nuclear policy conferences of the USA, Russia, European Union, China, and India. She has also contributed to the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, especially in some of their recent work on hypersonic missiles and on nuclear risk reduction. She was member of Prime Minister's informal group on disarmament in 2012 and member executive board of the Indian Progress Society for a period of 3 years. She has also been part of several track to initiatives. She is currently on the board of directors of the Asia Pacific Leadership Network. She is the recipient of the prestigious K. Subramaniam Award in 2014, an honor conferred on a scholar for consistency and excellence in strategic and security studies. With this brief introduction of the learned speaker, let me not stand any more between her and the audience. Over to Dr. Resmi Kaji, convener of the event. Thank you so much. Over to you, Dr. Resmi.
So much, sir. Uh, uh, and
You are not audible.
yes,
Yeah,
am I
okay,
audible?
fine.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, audible, I hope, to everyone.
Yes, you are. I think we've lost you again, Dr. Kazi. Hello, Professor Kumar. Can you hear her?
Yeah. Okay. Dr. Sethi?
Yes.
Dr. Kazi has lost her connection, but no
I-
issues. Could you please now,
Yeah.
kindly begin your lecture?
Sure. Sure. Thank you so much.
so
I thought we had lost her connection for a while. But thank you so much, Professor Ravinder Kumar, for reading that biodata so loyally. It wasn't required at all, but thank you so much. And thank you, Professor Kaushiki, for having me on this platform. My congratulations to Jamia for its centenary year and to the Nelson Mandela Center for completing 15 years. It's an honor for me to be able to connect with the university and the students on this particular issue today afternoon. Most grateful to Dr. Kazi for putting this together. Reshmi and I have been old colleagues and friends from IDSA days, and I'm very glad that she could put me here to have this lecture for all of you. Since I was told by Dr. Kazi that in the class, the students have largely been studying the theoretical dimensions of nuclear arms control and disarmament and looking at the literature from the Cold War period that has existed over this. So we decided that I would then look at the current picture today. And since we already have a background from the historical dimension, I'm going to jump straight into what is the current situation. I hope my screen is visible.
Yes, it is. It is,
Okay.
Dr. Sethi.
Thank you. Thank you. So basically, as you can see, I've titled this slide as a sense of gloom and doom. And on the nuclear arms control and disarmament situation, there is this sense that prevails in the larger atmosphere, since there are so many things that are not happening the way they should. Of course, Professor Ravinder Kumar mentioned the ban treaty, and we will talk about it. But that seems like the only silver lining from the non-nuclear weapon states point of view, because none of the nuclear weapon states have any interest in the ban treaty as of now. But let's just concentrate first on nuclear arms control, because both of them, as you realize, are two different issues. So as you look at the nuclear arms control picture, we can see that the old architecture is under threat. I think there isn't a single day that passes for those of us who follow this subject to try and get a sense of where the treaties are headed. And whatever little bit now exists in the form of New START treaty is also severely under threat. But there's nothing new on the anvil. Even as the old, the arms control which had been built in terms of bilateral treaties between US and USSR and then Russia, everything seems to be crumbling, but nothing new is coming into the picture. In fact, if you see the two major countries, and now China as well, none of them has shown any interest in arms control. On the other hand, we see a sense of growing salience of nuclear weapons. In fact, you find nuclear modernization happening across all the nuclear weapon possessors. And there are 9 countries with nuclear weapons today. Each one of them is modernizing its nuclear weapons because they believe that these weapons are central to their national security, and interstate trust or confidence in each other is just so low at this moment. There is also a sense of mounting dangers, especially as you find the chances of inadvertent escalation rising. So it's not as if 2 nuclear weapon states will get into a nuclear conflict deliberately, but the fact that you can stumble into a nuclear war because of low trust levels and because of new technologies that are coming in, new doctrines that are coming in, and that there is no sense of dialogue between, in fact, most of the nuclear dyads are adversarial dyads at this moment in time. And therefore, there is this sense of an urgency about the risks which are rising as a result of some of the developments that we will talk about. So that's why I call this the sense of gloom and doom on the nuclear arms control picture. Moving on further, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, many of you would be familiar with it. This is this organization that brings out the journal called the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And every year in the month of January, they set the hand of minutes to indicate how close are we to 12 o'clock. 12 o'clock being Armageddon, the end of civilization. And they normally take into account 2 dimensions to fix the hand of the minutes. It's climate change, the climate concerns that we have, and it's the nuclear dimension. So based on what was sensed in January this year, we are today at 100 seconds to midnight. And as you can see, this is the closest that we have ever been to midnight. Till last year, we were at 2 minutes to midnight, which wasn't a comfortable situation. But since the real estate that exists for the hand of the minutes to move is just so limited, they moved it up now to 100 seconds to midnight. This is just a graphic description of the kind of dangers that we are feeling in the nuclear domain. And this is particularly amongst all the people who deal with these issues, who talk about nuclear dimensions in various aspects. So my question then to all of us is, what will wake us up? If we are at 100 seconds to midnight and almost like sleepwalking to nuclear Armageddon, then what is it that is going to wake us up? Historically, 2 incidents have propelled nuclear arms control. I think all of you who have been studying history would know them. One is the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which was 13 days of intense danger between the US and USSR, when both countries felt that they were at the nuclear precipice because of these missiles that had been mounted by the Soviet Union on Cuba, in Cuba, and the US did not take kindly to that. So therefore, this was that period when the US was asking the USSR to remove the missiles from Cuba, and USSR and Cuba, interestingly, egging it on, did not want those missiles to be moved from that place. So therefore, there was this intense, period in which we have this phase where both sides felt that they could very easily get off the nuclear edge. This then led to a shared desire for strategic stability. Now, strategic stability is a concept that has not really been defined. But what has happened over a period of time, because after 62, when people started talking about strategic stability, it has been fleshed into 2 elements. One is crisis stability, and the other is arms race stability. So crisis stability is a situation which is obtained when between two nuclear adversaries, when you are in a moment of crisis, there is no temptation to reach for the nuclear trigger first because of the knowledge that the other side will be able to do retaliation and cause you unacceptable damage. So the idea of mutual vulnerability, which came in with the build-up of second strike capability, your ability to retaliate. Once that was suitably built up on both sides in US and USSR, a situation of crisis stability was obtained. And arms race stability was essentially that you would not be moving from offense to defense to offense to defense. So the spiral of building up arms one after the other, when you're good in offense, then the other side builds up defense. And then when they become defense, good in defense, then you start building up your offensive capability. So that spiral is put to an end by arms race stability. And the SALT talks, or the strategic arms limitation talks that happened in the period of the 1960s, leading to the SALT agreements in 1970s, came directly out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Another thing that came out of here that you must be aware of is the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, that had begun to be negotiated from the end of the 1960s. And by 1971, the ABM Treaty had been put into place between the US and USSR, putting an end to the offense-defense spiral, because both sides agreed to keep themselves mutually vulnerable to each other's damage. Deterrence is built on that idea. The bedrock of deterrence is the idea of mutual vulnerability. You hit me, I hit you back, and neither of us gains anything in the process except for mutual assured destruction. So therefore, the ABM Treaty brought in a sense of arms race stability. The other major incident in history which is important is the Able Archer exercise that happened in 1983. This was an exercise that was done by US and NATO forces in Europe, in the European theater. And while they were conducting an exercise, which was the largest exercise they were conducting, at that moment in time, including looking at escalation from the conventional to the nuclear level, the USSR picked up the signals as if they were getting ready to attack the USSR. And they had readied up their own arsenal, taken up their alert levels at the conventional and up to the nuclear level, believing that an attack from US and NATO was imminent. Fortunately, nothing happened at that time. But when President Reagan was apprised of what could have happened, because the USSR had readied up its own offensive capability, he was quite shaken by the fact that the USSR could have thought that an exercise could actually escalate to an actual attack on the USSR. Fortunately for us, and that's where leaderships become extremely important. We had Mikhail Gorbachev in the USSR, and he was extremely cooperative in terms of attending to the risk which both sides were feeling in a shared manner. This sharing, the sense of sharing of the risks is extremely important for us to get to any kind of arms control. Both sides have to sense that there is a risk. Only then will they take an action to address the risk that both of them are feeling to the same intensity. So the Able Archer exercise became another incident which woke up the world, and they started thinking about arms control treaties. So we had then the INF Treaty, the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, so many of them that came out of what happened because of the wake-up calls that we got during this period. So both sides began to see arms control as a desirable goal. And this is what is missing in today's times. Nobody is looking at arms control as a desirable, because what they are feeling is that by increasing risks, by getting into crisis instability or arms race instability, we are actually enhancing deterrence. But let me not go there before talking about why arms control was seen as a desirable goal. It was meant to deal with nuclear dangers. It was a component of military strategy pursued through diplomacy. So it wasn't as if either side was doing the other a favor. They were looking at it as part of their military strategy. which was being pursued through diplomatic measures like the treaties, which were negotiated between the two sides. The idea was to maximize your own advantage of military superiority. So each side was believing that they were actually freezing their own capability at a militarily superior level. So with this sense of compromise that existed between the two, arms control became possible. They felt they were minimizing the adversary's ability to spring strategic surprise, and above all, the US and USSR, considering that they were having to deal with the larger community as well, particularly in the Non-Proliferation Treaty framework. It was a way of showcasing restraint to the wider community, because the voices in favor of disarmament versus the burden or the responsibilities that have been placed on non-nuclear weapon states in the NPT on non-proliferation, these voices have gone on increasing. And therefore, arms control became one way for the nuclear weapon states, particularly US and USSR, which were only the major players before the Cold War ended. For them, it became a way of showing to the world that we are working towards reducing nuclear dangers by controlling the arms that we have. So some important bilateral nuclear arms control treaties that came into play. We had warhead reductions in the form of START 1 and 2 in the 1990s, and then the new START that came into being in 2011 after having been concluded in 2010. This is the treaty which is currently under question because it's going to expire in February 2021. Some of the arms control treaties also banned a weapon system. So they were not just reducing warheads or launchers of missiles, but some of them banned a particular weapon system. For example, the ABM Treaty in 1972 banned the deployment of ballistic missile defense. So both sides, as I suggested earlier, were saying that we are vulnerable to each other's damage. The decision in the ABM Treaty was that only one site would be allowed to be protected by a particular country, and you could choose what that site would be. So the US chose the silos, whereas the USSR chose Moscow as the nuclear command and control center. But except for this one place that was going to be protected by missile defense, the ability to intercept missiles as they're coming in, the rest of the country was open to damage or destruction by nuclear weapons of the other side. Another treaty that banned a weapon system was the INF Treaty, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which has again been in the news because President Trump decided to move out of the INF Treaty last year. This treaty had come into force in 1987, essentially banning missile systems that were between the range of 500 kilometers to 5,500 kilometers. So either you could have short-range missiles, which were less than 500 kilometers, or you could have intermediate, intercontinental range missiles, which would be more than 5,500. So that was the general concept of banning one entire weapon system, a range of missiles by the INF Treaty. Another important dimension of nuclear arms control treaties is when they address conventional imbalance. So as you remember, between the NATO and the Warsaw Pact, the feeling was that the Warsaw Pact was conventionally far superior to what NATO countries were. And therefore, NATO and the US had a first use nuclear strategy, where they wanted to deter the superior conventional capability of the Warsaw Pact, USSR and its allies. And therefore, in order to address this imbalance, the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty came into being in the 1990s. And the reason I'm putting these out for you is that there are different types of arms control treaties that have existed in the past. If we want to pick up certain precedents from there for today's times, because when people begin to argue that because of the conventional asymmetry, there cannot be arms control, well, we have been there before, and there have been some kind of arms control treaties that have handled that situation. And each one of them is a great learning in terms of the build-up of how circumstances led us to these negotiations and the arms control. But then now we come to more current times, where we begin to see the start of collapse of nuclear arms control. And this I attribute to the US withdrawal from the ABM Treaty in 2002. President Bush Jr., he decided that ABM was no longer in the interest of the US because of the ballistic missile threats that had emerged in the environment. And he was largely referring to some of the smaller countries which had come up with suspected small nuclear arsenals at that time. And he felt that these were the kind of arsenals that the US could defend itself against. You could not deter these countries because of the nature of the political systems in them. He was largely referring to Iraq, Iran, North Korea, and he saw them as countries which had a certain streak of brinksmanship which could not be deterred, but they could be defended against because of the technology which had risen in the US, and because they were, you had to intercept only a very small number of nuclear tipped missiles. But what happened when he moved out of the ABM? It upset the deterrence which is premised on the idea of mutual vulnerability. Because if he could start projecting that a missile defense can be deployed to protect myself, so I can attack with my nuclear weapons, but you will not be able to retaliate to cause me unacceptable damage because my missile defense will be able to do damage limitation for myself. Now, this goes against the grain of the idea of nuclear deterrence, which I explained to you is built on the idea of vulnerability, the ability to be able to damage the other side. So the BMD then became a spoiler in the relationship between the US, Russia, and China. Because even though the US was saying my ballistic missile defense is not against Russia and China, both of them believed that the missile defense will be deployed to an expanse in the coming years, that it will undercut their own deterrence. This has led to the offense-defense spiral that you see in today's times, where you see China and Russia talking about new weapon systems, hypersonic missiles, underwater drones. All of this is coming because of their fear of the ballistic missile defense and their inability to be able to cause unacceptable damage to the US. So once the US withdrew from ABM, Russia put an end to its commitment to START II, which predates New START Treaty, and it moved out of the CFE. So you can see the start of the collapse of arms control happening from then on. More recently now, President Trump has withdrawn from the INF in 2019, making allegations of Russian violations. But even more than Russia, people have, reached the conclusion that the actual worrisome factor for the US is that 95% of the Chinese missiles are in the INF range. Since China was never constrained, it actually built so many thousands of missiles in the ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers, which is really the mainstay of the nuclear arsenal today. And this is not something that the US likes, because they don't have a capability which China seems to have. And for that reason, US has withdrawn from the INF. You see further collapse with the US ending the Open Skies Treaty in 2020, which is essentially an end of cooperation on short notice overflights for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So the Open Skies Treaty, which was with 34 countries, US and Russia and its allies, and US and NATO, 34 countries, which allowed overflight on their territory for recce aircraft carrying no military weapons on them, but with sensors, to be able to see the kind of military capability build-up that was going on in that particular country. So the US has now gotten out of the Open Skies Treaty. The rest of the countries are yet to decide whether they can still continue without the US participation or not. And the last one that I want to talk about here is the possible demise of New START in 2021. Even though US-Russia negotiations have started in June 2020, both sides are alleging that the other side is imposing impossible conditions for agreement to extend the treaty. So therefore, the prospects as of now look dim. The US has at least reached the agreement that we can do without China for now, but that China can be part of some other arms control agreements once the New START remains functional between US and Russia. But with the shadow of the US elections there, with Russia, pushing it hard in terms of what it can get, of not having to accept further inspections under the New START, we see that the road is going to be extremely rocky, and we will perhaps go up to the end of the term of New START before we get an answer on whether it's going to be extended or not. So what we see then is that these countries are ready to play arms race, arms race. They're not talking about arms control. You have President Trump, who has been wanting to expand his nuclear capability, and he has the support of the Congress, US Congress on this. And here the expression of, I think, President Putin says it all, that he's not going to give up very easily, and that he is giving it back to the US, building all kinds of new capabilities that Russia likes to unveil every now and then. So President Trump is being apprised on some of the bad news, which is that Putin presents superior nukes. And when he asks what is the good news, he's told, well, you still have got the biggest button. And as you can see, this is a pun on some of the dialogue that you had between, or the drama that you saw between US and North Korea, when both presidents were fighting over who has the bigger button. Now, in response to the superior nukes of Russia, the US, in its nuclear posture review of 2018, has come up with the idea of nukes in a new size, which is the idea of limited nuclear war or small nuclear weapons, a concept which had been given up again by Reagan and Gorbachev when they made that iconic statement after their summit in Reykjavik, where they said that nuclear war cannot be won and therefore should not be fought. That led to the lowering of the temperatures and the arms control that we talked about just now. But we are back into the old times again, talking about the ideas of limited nuclear war. So where are we then? And as you can see, the number of players have gone on increasing. We are in times of a surrounding nuclear cacophony, where there are changing doctrines. As I told you, the doctrine is talking about an expanded role for nuclear weapons in most of the countries. It's no longer only for deterrence of nuclear weapons. It's for deterrence of conventional capability, deterrence of cyber, deterrence of attacks in space assets, all of that. Nuclear weapons is meant to deter this entire range or spectrum of threats that we are beginning to see. We are looking at new technologies coming in the form of artificial intelligence, hypersonic, cyber offensives, and we don't know yet how these are going to intersect with nuclear deterrence. During the Cold War period that we now look back upon with a certain amount of nostalgia, there was this clear-cut distinction between conventional and nuclear. You see a blurring of lines today. In fact, countries want to blur those lines because they believe it actually enhances their deterrence. So China talks about dual-use capability, dual-use capable missiles. So does Pakistan. And the idea of doing this commingling of their missiles is to stop the adversary. In their mind, they are enhancing deterrence. But from the other side, when you look at it, you're also enhancing the risks because of misperception, of miscalculation. And you see a changing language where it has become far more casual or cavalier in its approach to how we look at nuclear weapons. All this is happening in times of strident hyper-nationalism. So all of the major nuclear powers are more and more nationalist in their approach to things. Nobody is looking at international security, and that's where you lose out by having this approach about America first, China dream, India first. So everything is being seen from a rather nationalist prism. So the current challenge to nuclear arms control then is that you have more players. Unlike US, USSR being the only two players at that time, negotiations were far easier than they would be on a multilateral level. We have low interstate trust among major players. Each one of the players is on a different perch of capability. So there is no parity, not in numerical terms, not in capability terms. So therefore, when you do arms control, how do you do it when everybody is at different levels of capability? Who will accept what in order to, have a common denominator on some of these issues? There is no shared sense of risks. In fact, doctrines of brinksmanship are being adopted to create risks, because creating those risks is seen as good for deterrence. And there is an emphasis on absolute security rather than mutual vulnerability. And then there is emerging unregulated technologies, because nobody is talking about any kind of controls over your cyber, autonomous weapon systems, or hypersonics. These are seen as the emerging ones. Nobody wants to put a stop on them because you don't know what is the potential of this and where all it could lead you to. So then, what about nuclear disarmament? The ban treaty has been mentioned. So obviously, I mean, disarmament should be doing well. But actually, when you look at it, this treaty that came into being in 2017 after the United Nations General Assembly resolution had called upon member states to participate in the treaty negotiations, but unfortunately none of the nuclear weapon states participated in the negotiations. The treaty was concluded largely by the non-nuclear weapon states and adopted in the General Assembly in 2017 with 122 votes in favor, which is not a small number. Which indicates the sentiment of the nations in the world. However, when it was opened for signature on 20th September 2017, 50 countries signed on the same day. But as was pointed out by Professor Ravinder Kumar, the entry into force will be possible only 90 days after 50 ratifications. 45 are already on board. It's not going to be very difficult to get 5 more. But these are countries which don't have nuclear weapons. The small countries like Macau and Nauru, who are the ones who have ratified this treaty. So the meaning of that treaty, without bringing in the nuclear weapon states, is not going to be of much help. The treaty, nevertheless, prohibits development, testing, production, manufacture, acquisition, transfer, possession, use, threat of use of nuclear weapons. So it's a treaty that does all of this. But the basic objection that many countries have to this treaty is US, UK, and France. They have put out a joint statement at the time when the treaty was opened for signature to say, we don't intend to sign, ratify, or ever become party to it. So you can see the kind of language that has been used to emphasize their rejection of this particular treaty. Russia said it was a destructive treaty, and they fear that the NPT will suffer as a result of the ban treaty because the countries will get divided, and they see it as a hasty initiative. China said that we accept the goal of final and comprehensive ban, but not in this manner. So they don't like the form of the ban treaty. And India, which has been a consistent campaigner for nuclear disarmament, however, rejected the treaty because it said that the treaty did not allow for verification, enforcement, or compliance. So nuclear weapon states, the treaty language says that nuclear weapon states can join the treaty by removing nuclear weapons from operational status. You can keep them in headstock. You might not destroy the arsenal, but as long as it's not operational, you can join the treaty. Now, this is obviously not acceptable to the nuclear possessors because they don't trust each other. There is no definition in the treaty of what does it mean to destroy nuclear arsenals. Each country is supposed to come up with its own time-bound plan, and that's supposed to be legally binding. But who is going to enforce it? Who defines what is legally binding and a time-bound plan? And verified and irreversible elimination. So essentially, as you can see, India's problem has been with the lack of verification that a treaty like this is going to bring into question. Some of the other disarmament moves that I want to highlight before I end with my next slide. And this is about letting you know that some other measures are being contemplated by different countries. So when you hear about them or you want to write about them, these are some of the things that you should keep in your mind. One is the US, which has come up with creating environment on nuclear disarmament, what they call the SEND initiative, creating environment for nuclear disarmament. And their general argument with this initiative is that first we need to create the right environment, only then can we talk about disarmament. Now, many countries in Europe have criticized this for saying that who determines when there will be the right environment to take certain steps towards disarmament. But nevertheless, many countries have been participating along with the US in some of the meetings in trying to thrash out the concept of SEND. Stockholm, Sweden, has come up with what they call the Stepping Stones Initiative, where they've laid down certain measures which can be like the stepping stones to get to the world of disarmament, much like the roadmaps or the plans like the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan, which had been put out by India in 1988. There is also a UN governmental group of experts on nuclear disarmament verification regime. Now, this is an interesting concept because for many of us, the general criticism of getting to disarmament is that it's not verifiable. India, for instance, has been saying that how will you verify? And the governmental group of experts set up by the UN in 2018, they presented their report in May 2019, basically exploring what can be the contours of a verification regime that can be put in place. So who would the inspectors be? How many times would inspections happen? What would need to be inspected? Would it be the life cycle of the entire nuclear weapon? Would it also be additional facilities? How will this entire concept be worked out? That is where a significant amount of research is going. And it's a very interesting space to be in to understand this. Now, India's insistence is on a nuclear weapons-free world, which is multilaterally negotiated. It doesn't want something that only US, Russia, and China bring together and impose on the rest of the world. So it has to include the other, stakeholders. It has to be non-discriminatory after our experience with the NPT. It needs to be verifiable and it needs to be universal. So the same set of responsibilities should apply across all nations. This is not in sight yet. So therefore, still such measures can be taken towards disarmament, because we started by saying that countries are putting so much effort into building their nuclear weapons right now because they see them as central to their national security. So till such time as disarmament can come about, nuclear arms control can be helpful as a way of reducing nuclear dangers. For India, we have looked at arms control largely from the prism of our Cold War experience, which was to see it as technology denial regimes. But in the current context in which India is, where you face the concept of crisis instability with Pakistan every time a crisis breaks out, and you are facing the problem of arms race instability with China, because China is improving its capability, and therefore there is every likelihood that you will also be sucked into that arms race. In order to address both these challenges that India has, nuclear arms control can be a way that can take us out of this picture. So my last slide then is, what can you and I do? Why does all this matter to us? I think what we can do is to understand nuclear risks and to raise awareness about those risks, because the political leader doesn't have the time to look at these issues. So therefore, when you study history of nuclear arms control, you are able to pick out the pointers for decision makers on what worked. When did it work? What were the circumstances in which something became possible? And how were those negotiations carried forward? During the Cold War period, when the arms control negotiations were going on, the US and USSR were what were known as arms control careerists, who made their entire career, their life, in arms control negotiations. And there is a lot to be learned from that experience, which can be brought in terms of adapting it to the current circumstances and for the different nuclear dyads that we are living with. This will help us to seek political attention and consensus to this particular issue, so that we can demand international action on this, because no one country is going to be able to resolve arms control. So we need to suggest possible measures, think about them in these times, so that when leaders who are willing to take up these issues are available, we have some ideas ready to be handed over to the political decision makers. 75 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and this is the year that we commemorated 75th year of the dropping of bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I don't think any of us wants a repeat of that to happen, whether it's deliberate or inadvertent. And my sense is, more than the risk of deliberate nuclear war, it's the risk of inadvertent nuclear war because of misperceptions, mistaken concepts, beliefs of the other side, that we could stumble into a war that none of us actually wants. So I will stop here, and I look forward to having an interactive session with you.
Thank you so much, Manpreet. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you. That was brilliant. And I knew always, I mean, thank you so much for calling me colleague, but you know, to you, I look upon as my role model than anything else. And I'm sure many, you know, like me, you know, they regard you as their role model as well. So thank you so much, Manpreet. And yes, the picture that you, you know, presented before us, there are a lot of gloom in that. There are so many concerns, there's so many things to worry about, but definitely what I can say is that yeah, there is still a lot more, you know, like it's not completely a sense of despair that we see. There are a lot of things that can be done. So the foot is in, it's not completely that, you know, the door is shut, the foot is in. And it's much lies upon us, you know, I mean, apart from the politicians, much lies upon us in raising the awareness. And I think this is a wonderful platform, particularly the academic institutions, where, you know, we are able to raise this awareness amidst, you know, the young minds, experts coming and speaking to us and letting us know, you know, what the real situation is and how much we can do to contribute in terms of reducing the nuclear dangers that lies ahead of us. There are a lot of things which, you know, like I wish I could sit with you for hours and talk about, but this is for these students. They are very excited about it, about the course. I have quite an overwhelming number in my class. We have been speaking about your work as well, even my previous batch. So I leave it to my students, my dear students, and of course the faculty members, the other guests as well. Very much, Professor Ajay Darshan Behra is here, Ambassador Rajagopalan is here. Thank you so much for being here, sir. I leave it to, I open the floor, and I am sure Manpreet will, you know, welcome your questions. We can have a very productive discussion, and then I will take over. Thank you. The floor is open now for questions. I already have one question from Mr. Zahur Dar. He asked, why should military industrial complexes allow disarmament treaties to succeed, given the fact that great powers such as the US are withdrawing rooms for arms agreement treaties? Manpreet, over to you.
Thanks so much. A great question to start with, because I'm glad he's drawn our attention to the military-industrial complex, which has a vested interest in not allowing you know, arms racing to stop. So in fact, every time, if you remember when the New START was being negotiated, it was concluded, and then when it had to be ratified by the US Congress, President Obama had to give a tacit approval to the labs, the nuclear labs in the US, to say that so much money will be given to